Hello, I am so happy today to be with my friend Analee Byers, probably one of the most amazing young women I know. Annalee's been through a lot. Annalee and her family with the loss of their little Micah. And Annalee, I really appreciate you sharing what you have experienced, what you've learned, what your grief process was like. I've known you since you were a young girl because your dad was my kid's pediatrician. And
I
your
think I
mom
was
was a friend of
12 when
mine.
I first met you.
Is that right?
I think
Okay.
so.
All right. Back in 1996.
Oh, I would have been 14, 13. Close.
Well, there you go. Well, 12 to 13, that's a big age difference every year when you're between 12 and 18. It's like a whole lifetime that you live.
Yes, it is.
You would have never known back at 13 that you'd be sitting here having this conversation.
Nope. There's no way I could have anticipated this.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing. And I also wanted to acknowledge that your mom your mom Heidi's on the other side of the veil with your little Micah now. And boy, was she one of the neatest women I've ever known. Just fun and smart. And I miss her. I'm sure you miss her so much.
I do miss her a lot, but I can feel her presence often. And I know she's over there just helping us through.
That's amazing. Well, Annalee, why don't you start by giving me a brief life sketch about you, your family, your husband, kids, all about your life.
So I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and was originally born in Phoenix, but my parents moved up here when I was a baby as my dad went into his practice as a pediatrician. I'm number 6 of 8 children, and my mother, when I was young, decided that she wanted to have a family band. So she had us all learn how to play musical instruments, and it has been instrumental in some of my siblings' lives and career choices as they've gotten older. But I always leaned more towards the medicine track and was determined to become a veterinarian growing up, and started into the Washington State University program in college to do the 7-year vet program, and my dad talked me out of it.
Is that right?
Yeah, he said, "Do you want to be a mother?" And I said, "Yes, more than anything." And he said, "That will be really hard if you're a large animal vet." Because that's what I always said I was going to be, was a large animal vet. And so he convinced me to go into nursing. Okay. He said, "You'll have the job flexibility you need. You'll be able to have a family." And so I changed my major. I met my husband in high school, and we didn't start dating until just after high school. And he went to University of Arizona. So when I switched my major, I decided to move down there and just see if this relationship was going to go anywhere, which my parents were not thrilled about, but that's what I did. So we continued dating. I went through the nursing program and got my nursing degree, and we got married just before our senior year of college. And then we kind of lived all over. We moved to Virginia, lived there for 3 years, and then to Australia and lived there for 3 years, and then to Denver, where we lived for 6 years, and then back to Spokane. So our oldest son was born in Australia. We moved when he was about 6 months old. And then our other 3 children were born in Denver. So I have Truman is now 13, Betty is now 12, or almost 12 in like 2 weeks. And then Hank is 10, and Micah would be 7. So that's kind of us. So I've worked mainly as a pediatric emergency department nurse And through the majority of my career, I worked in the regular emergency department in Australia, just because they didn't have the department that I was used to.
Uh-huh.
And now I work in home health with the pediatric population, mainly with kids with complex medical issues, which I love. I love working with my clients, and they are just precious angels.
You know, Annalee, that's really remarkable that that your training is in pediatric nursing, especially considering what you went through with Micah, and also that you are still able to work in that population, even though you had a child going through a major medical issue. Can you speak a little bit to your journey with Micah and maybe touch on how you're able to continue in that sphere, why that's a good place for you?
Yeah, so Micah was diagnosed with cancer when he was 8 months old, which was always my favorite age. He was the happiest, most bubbly, just lovely baby. I remember calling my dad and saying, he never cries. Like, this is weird. And he said, yes, some babies don't. It's okay. But he just always was. And when he got sick with cancer, I knew something was wrong. And I took him to the pediatrician, and she said, I'm going to send you to the emergency department. And she asked if I had felt his belly, and I said no. And so I felt his belly, and you could very clearly feel his spleen and his liver. And I knew at that moment that he had leukemia.
Oh, wow.
But it was so rare that I didn't want to believe that I was right. And so I called a friend and that had coincidentally moved up from Denver and had watched my kids for me when I was when I would work night shift. She would take care of my kids so I could sleep. So my kids knew her well. So I called her and I said, can you get my kids from school? And she said, well, what do you think's wrong? And I said, I think he's got leukemia. And she said, there's no way. And I said, I hope I'm wrong.
Right.
But I was unfortunately right. And he was admitted to the pediatric cancer ward, and we fought valiantly over the next 3 or 4 days to save his life. And he recovered from that and started chemo and got him into remission within a month. And then about a month after that, he relapsed. And at that point, the oncologist said the only hope for him is a bone marrow transplant. And coincidentally, Seattle Children's is the best in the world for infant bone marrow transplant.
Wow.
So we decided, she gave me the option of going to Seattle versus going to Salt Lake. And I said, well, Seattle's the best. Why wouldn't I not go to the best? So we went to Seattle in February. So Micah was 14 months old at that point. Or 13 months, in there. And he had his bone marrow transplant a month after our arrival there. And 2 days after that, he had a seizure that lasted for 3 hours.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was really disheartening because the code team would not listen to me as I told them over and over that he was having a seizure. They didn't believe me. But ultimately, they finally figured it out and stopped the seizure. So I don't know how much damage that did to his brain. But over the next 3 weeks, he seemed to be recovering. And then he started having these tonic spasms, is the best way I can explain it. And I recognized them as something I had seen as a pediatric ER nurse. And they were called infantile spasms, which are incredibly damaging to a baby's brain.
Oh.
And so I tried very hard to get them to listen to me. And they gave medication to try to stop it, but they just couldn't. And so I watched him slowly fade away over the next couple months. And so that was extremely difficult. But ultimately, like, he got discharged, I think it was the beginning of May from the hospital, but it was just in and out. We'd be out for a couple of days and then back, and then out for a couple of days and then back, because he would get fevers, or their seizures would change, or there was just complication after complication. So finally, the end of June, we were able to come back to Spokane. And the oncologist, I could tell, was not expecting Micah to look how he did. And the rest of the nurses that we had known before, you could tell, did not expect him to be like he was. And that was devastating, because I realized at that point, nobody knows what his outcome is going to be, what's going to happen. And I had to fight tooth and nail that summer to try and keep him home. But because of my medical training, he was able to spend more time at home. The doctor trusted my judgment and trusted me to do what was best, and that she knew I would call if there were issues. But her big worry was that I wouldn't get the rest I needed. So they set up home nursing care for him. That was not started until about November. And then we went through, all those COVID years and all of that. But the medical training helped immensely in keeping Micah home more, and in helping me to recognize when there was a true emergency, when something needed to be, when an intervention needed to happen. Or
wow.
I think I answered your question.
Wow. Annalee, why do you think the team in Seattle discounted your experience? They knew you were a pediatric emergency room nurse. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, so I talked to the bone marrow transplant doctor. I had actually run into her when I was walking back from getting a snack at the cafeteria or something, and she was leaving for the day. And this was just like an hour before he went into the seizure. And she said, "Don't worry, we're going to get him on an IV pain medication tomorrow," because his pain was starting to get worse, which is expected. And she called me that evening because they must have updated her on what was happening. And she said, "I am so sorry. They had a sentinel event that happened a few months ago with narcotics, meaning a child had died because they had not recognized that that child was not metabolizing narcotic medication properly."
Oh, no.
So I think that's why they went that route and said, "This has to be narcotics." And I kept saying, "No, he's not on anything big." And
Right.
they just,
wow.
And the attending came to me and sat down next to me while they were running the code, because the fellow was running the code. And she said, "I want to remind you of a few things. We know that he is breathing." And I said, "I know." And she said, "So we know that the damage to his brain will be minimal because he is breathing on his own." And I said, I know. She said, "She'll get there. Just give us time to figure this out," because they ended up taking him to CT scan, which didn't show anything. Because you can't see that damage right away. It takes a while to evolve. So I think that's why. But I don't know. It's just, they didn't know about my training completely.
Right.
I don't know.
And I think a lot of parents in a situation similar to yours will have thoughts, feelings, impressions. And I think it happens a lot that they feel like they're not listened to, that they're dismissed, or they have a bad experience with the medical team.
Yeah.
And that's really hard, especially when you're part of that bigger team. You speak their language.
Yeah. And I mean, it got to the point where they kind of figured that out, like there was one of the rounds where I counted 30 doctors that were there to discuss his case. And one of the residents leaned over and said, "Don't worry, I'll explain everything after." And I leaned over and said, "I'm following along just fine, but thank you." And then the attending said, "So you're a PEM doc, right?" And I said, "Actually, I'm a nurse." But yes, PEM stands for pediatric emergency medicine. So I said, "Yes, I do have training." So then that resident kind of backed up and went, "Oh, well, I don't have to do anything." But the nurses got to know me well and respected me quite a bit. So that helped.
This is a question I don't think I've ever asked anybody before, but having been in that situation where you're with your child in this critical environment, what counsel would you give to a parent who's trying to navigate knowing their child and interacting with the medical team? That, I mean, we both know that these people are doing their best and that they're never trying to do harm. But what's your counsel for how to interact with that team if somebody found themselves in that situation?
When the emergency is happening, is not necessarily the time to try to exert your will unless you think what they're doing is going to be very detrimental. Because as a pediatric emergency nurse, I have been in those situations as the provider, trying to our best to save a child, and having parents insert themselves sometimes hinders us quite a bit. The time for that is to make sure that interventions that you want done are known well beforehand, if you can, and if not, so what I ended up doing is just to point out like small things. So I stood next to the fellow and I said, "He is seizing." And she kind of looked and I said, "His heart rate is elevated. He's grinding his teeth. His eyes are deviated. His fingers are splayed." Like I was clearly stating what she was seeing to try to get her to go that direction, and she still wouldn't deviate. So I ended up just sitting down, and my dad was there with me at that point, and he just put his hand on my knee and he said, "It's going to be okay." And I said, "But they're not stopping the seizure." And he said, "But it will be okay." And my dad is a pediatrician with like 30 years of experience. Right. So I just went, "Okay, I'll try and just be calm."
Right.
Because if you're not calm, if you're not able to control yourself, they will kick you out of the room. And I have had to do that, and it's heartbreaking. Right. We don't want to do that.
Right.
But if it's going to hinder the care team, it has to be done. And I hate that.
Right. No, that's really good. That's good counsel. Because if you putting yourself in someone else's shoes while they're trying to do their most critical work, it is hard to have somebody yelling at you because now your focus is being it's shifting between the child in this emergency situation and then the parent who's upset, which is absolutely natural and normal, and for the parent to be upset. But I can see how it could compromise your child's care in some situations if they're having to focus on you while they're trying to attend to your child.
It's a hard line. It's a hard balance.
Very hard. When Steve was in his residency, his wife was in the hospital getting a bone marrow transplant for leukemia, and that hearing him explain what that was like was quite an experience, trusting,
Yes.
trying to trust those who are helping, but then also having to work that through your own medical mind. That must have been really hard. I'm so
It was very
sorry
hard.
you went through all of that. How did you manage with your kids while you were back and forth to Seattle, or when you were there for that long period of time?
So my husband's amazing. And he saw this. He was so funny. He's like, "You're being deployed. This is like the military. You're being deployed for 5 months."
Wow.
And he saw it as that, and he just tried his best to maintain the status quo. And I set up things to make things easier. And I feel like the Lord did too, because there were people put in our path that were able to step in and fill a need, sometimes that we didn't even know we had. So like we found a girl that was doing Running Start for high school that was able to babysit the children. And we found her because one of my dear friends that lived in the Seattle area had used her as a babysitter.
Oh, wow.
And she said, "I have this friend. She is looking for a babysitting job." And she was perfect for that role. And then like my youngest, Hank, was in preschool and he only went half day, which is tricky. So they had an aftercare program, but part of the stipulation was you had to be able to pick up your child. And because he had an IEP, because he is autistic and has epilepsy and other issues, the bus would pick him up to take him and was supposed to give him a ride back, but not if he was doing aftercare. But the principal at that school was really dear friends with my sister-in-law and said, "We can make this work." And allowed him to ride the bus.
Wow.
So there were, and then
what a connection in all the area of Seattle.
Yeah, there were so many things like that, like the people at church that helped with laundry, and they would provide a couple meals every week, and they would, and help with snow removal and help with so many things. And then my father-in-law lived nearby, and he would come and help with things. And then I had siblings that would come for periods of time to help. My parents were there so they could help. So there were just all of these helpers that the Lord had lined up that were there to support. And my wonderful husband would bring my children at least every couple weeks to Seattle to see us, to see Micah, and to have some time together as a family. And that really helped keep me sane. But I think one of the things that really helped a lot as well was my dear sister that lived in the Tri-Cities made sure I never had a weekend alone in Seattle.
Oh, wow.
So either she would come, or my brother that lived in Oregon would come, or my other sister from Utah would fly in, or there was always somebody. And I knew I could count on her because there was one time Micah got readmitted to the ICU and he was incredibly uncomfortable, and I ended up holding and rocking him all night. But he was nursing all through all of this. And so when he had his brain injury, I was still pumping milk, and they would give it to him through his feeding tube. And I turned to the nurse at one point and I said, "I have to pump. I'm going to explode." And she said, "Here, hand him to me. Hand me Micah." And I handed her, and I pumped as fast as I could and got 16 ounces or something ridiculous. And she's like, "I've never seen anybody pump that quickly and that much." And I'm like, "I don't know."
You're a big overachiever.
Yeah. And so I called my sister after that and I said, I'm not going to make it. I've gotten 2 hours of sleep. I'm barely hanging on. And she got in a car and drove immediately to rescue me. So there was a village,
yes,
a village of people that just were there. And
Wow.
Steve was one of those people that was there. So it was awesome, this
I don't
amount of
I
support
don't
we had.
remember that, but I'm glad.
No, he would, every week at church, he would give an update on what was happening with Micah. And he consistently told people, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. They're going to need help for a long time. And because he had been through it himself and knew.
That's right. Now I
So,
remember that.
yeah,
That was one of his real gems that he had taken from his experience. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint. They are going to need
yes.
help for a long time. That
Mhm.
that right there is a really important principle to understand, right? When somebody is going through a very prolonged, difficult experience, any kind of experience, it is not an event that you can show up for and embrace and then go back to normal life, 3 days later. People need they need they need you to be there a week out, a month out, sometimes a year out.
Yeah, that is very true.
Right. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing to think about, because it can look like it's just all this chaos because there's a million things happening with each child has needs, you and your husband have these different, health needs, sleep needs, all of those things. And yet when the Lord, is involved, it's this perfect orchestra of help and care and love. And another thing that it impresses me is how, I don't know if this happened to you growing up, where people would watch your family go by maybe and count and be like incredulous, like as they're counting how many children there are, obviously in this family. I mean, I came from a family of 7, and I remember people counting and thinking, holy moly, people have 7, 8 kids.
Yeah.
But but in my time, when I had the most desperate need for family and love, my siblings were right there for me. I had 6 people who loved me more than most people on the earth, and gave time and attention. And I'm so grateful that my parents were bold enough, maybe, to have the family they had, because it was such a huge blessing for me. It sounds like it was for you.
Oh yeah. And the Lord lined up people when I needed them. So like when Micah was diagnosed, my brother Andy had flown into town. I can't remember why, but he was in town, and so was my sister Liza was also in town. And so when he was diagnosed, my dad and my brother came and gave Micah a blessing and
Oh,
me a blessing.
yeah.
And then at the when we knew Micah was going to die and he was coming home on hospice, my brother was there. My brother Andy was there again. And I think it was a work thing. I'm not sure. But he was there, and the unit was locked down because of COVID restrictions or something. But they let him in.
Wow.
They let him in. They let him in, come and see us. And yeah, it was huge. You know,
Wow.
the Lord knew how to make sure that the support was there when we needed it.
I had a similar experience. I appreciate you sharing that, because I remember thinking myself, once the shock was kind of over and I could really process what had happened in my life, I remember thinking to myself, the Lord knew ahead of time this was going to be the hardest thing I was ever going to do. And I felt like he put as much cushion um, as he could. I felt like that he had really tried to make it as soft as possible for as hard of a thing it was going to be.
Yes. Yes. That's the impression I get as well, that the Lord knows this is coming. And he puts things in your path that will make it as easy as possible because he knows he can't take it away.
Right.
But he's going to make it as easy as he can.
Right. He's going to show his hand. And why wouldn't he? Because he loves us and he doesn't want to see us suffer.
Of course. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I spoke to a woman recently who had the really difficult experience of her husband going into, he had a stroke. They were driving together. He said, I don't feel well. He pulled over and had a stroke. But then the person behind them, the person in the car behind them that saw this happen and pulled over happened to be a nurse, started working on him. And then the person behind her was this woman's neighbor.
Oh my goodness.
Right? He said, we're going to follow this ambulance to the hospital. And so that was one of the conversations we had, is how much the Lord put into place in that moment.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you spoke a little bit about your husband and how amazing that he has been. Did you ever have any times where one of you was feeling more grief than the other, or where you had to pick each other up?
So we both process grief, I think, pretty differently, which he's of the mindset, which I think isn't a terrible mindset, is we're living in the moment. We're going to live in the moment and we're going to try our best to live in the moment. Mm-hmm. And he has waves of grief as well, but he does not really express them in the same way. And because I was Micah's primary caregiver for a few years, where my attention was often completely focused on Micah, the grief after he passed for me was very heavy because I was trying to find purpose again. And he would recognize that in me. He could see when it was getting to be too heavy. And he knew when to say, okay, let's move on and keep going. Or when he'd say, do you need a minute? Do you need a minute to sit in this? Do you want to go up and sit by his grave? Do you want, and it would give me those times to process and to have quiet if I needed it. But, and that was huge. But I think one of the things that was really instrumental in helping with grief was when Micah died, the oncologist had given me her cell phone number. And it wasn't till like a few days before he died that I had her direct number. Because I don't know, I never needed it before then. And so when he died, I called her and told her that he had passed. And she said, I want you to watch how your kids grieve and try to emulate them. She said, they will still have moments of happiness. They will still play and do things that they love, but they will still have moments of sadness too. And so she said, you need to find a balance with that and to not just sit in sorrow.
Wow, that is so insightful.
Yeah, it was really helpful.
Wow. And so did you do that? Did you start watching them? What did you see?
Yeah, I saw that. My youngest didn't really process that Micah was gone for good right away, which is a natural reaction, I think, with little kids. The older two, initially were very, very sad and did go through waves of grief, and both went through counseling to help with that. And it was an interesting process because they would still play their sports. They would still go swimming. They would still want to do all the fun things that kids like to do, but they'd have those moments of sadness too. And they would cry and they would mourn just as they should. But I didn't try to hinder joy in their lives either, you know.
Right. What kinds of things have you done as a family to think about Micah or commemorate him? Does he come up in certain situations?
There are moments. So Micah, after his brain injury, because his brain injury occurred when he was 14 months old, and then he died when he was 3.5. So he had 2 years of struggling with seizures every day and not having good control of his body. But one thing he always loved was balloons. Even before his brain injury, balloons were huge, and teddy bears were the other thing that he loved. So he would snuggle them and love them before his brain injury, and then he had a favorite teddy that we always just kept with him. And so when we see balloons or teddy bears, we always say, "Oh, there's Micah. Micah's thinking of us." Or,
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, that is really sweet.
Yep.
What was his personality like? You said he never cried.
He would cry some, like if he was hurting, but he was just a really happy kid. And like when he relapsed, they knew because his eye was getting swollen and we couldn't figure out why. So he had to have a procedure to biopsy that mass that was in his eye to see is this an infection or is this cancer? Like, is his cancer back? And so his eye got really swollen. So we had to patch his good eye so that it would keep his vision equal. And there he is. He can like barely see, and he's just happy and playing. Like just okay, can't really see, but I'll just keep going. Like that's always how he was. Just I have all these tubes and wires. Whatever, I'll figure it out. Like he's just always happy, always wanting to. And he'd get into things when he was little, and it was so darling and cute because we just were happy that he was there. So.
Oh, that is really fun. Sometimes people are insensitive to someone who is grieving or going through something hard. Did you experience that outside of the experience? You know, that frustrating experience of not being able to get the medical team to acknowledge what you were seeing. Just with lay people, did you have experiences that stand out?
I had people that didn't really understand maybe the gravity of the amount of grief that I was experiencing and would try to compare or grief that they were suffering for something that wasn't as big, you know, and that was hard in the moment, but since then, I have kind of changed my perspective on that because I came to realize that grief is grief no matter what. And we have different barometers due to our own experience on what that means in our lives. And so I think I needed to be more sensitive to that. It was hard in the moment, but I think I needed to be more sensitive to that and more understanding that other people's grief is real, even if it doesn't feel like it's the same caliber, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
And
but how did you get there? What was that realization?
I read this book. It's called The Choice by Edith Eva Eger. Well, I listened to it, the audiobook. Okay. And she is a Holocaust survivor, and her story is phenomenal, the things that she suffered through. And in the foreword of her audiobook, she tells the story about these two women, and one of them is grieving for her child that is dying and cries most of the session. And the next woman is grieving because her car got delivered in the wrong color. And
Okay.
and she said both tears were valid.
Mm.
And I sat there and thought about that. And I said, how can you look at these two situations and say these are both valid reasons to be this upset? But then she explains that the woman whose car got delivered in the wrong color has other things in her life that are making things challenging. It's not just about the car.
Right.
And
the car
so
is a
I think,
symbol.
yes, yes. And I think that we need to be slow to judge in those aspects because we don't know the backstory for everybody. And I don't know. So I think that I needed to be better about that, but we learn and grow, right?
I love that. I love that example, though. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. Yeah, it's not fair to try to evaluate how legitimate someone else's grief is.
Yeah.
We just don't know. And we don't know what kind of compound grief they've experienced. It might be just the latest in a series of other experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, when you look back on your life, is there anything that stands out to you that maybe helped you to be more resilient when this trial came?
There's a lot of things that I think helped to build me to the point where this felt like something I could handle. And part of it was the things I had experienced as a nurse, and learning to adapt in situations. So like when I started working as a nurse in Australia, they didn't even really interview me. We lived in Alice Springs, which is in the center of the country. There's nothing there. So I had gotten my nursing license in Australia before we arrived. So I went to the hospital to meet with the manager, and I thought it was going to be an interview, but she just kind of had me tour the unit and then said, "Can you start tomorrow?"
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Yeah, I can, but am I going to have orientation?" And she said, "We'll give you 3 days." And I hadn't ever done adult medicine.
Oh.
And they were using equipment that was at least 50 years old in some instances.
Wow.
And half the medications had different names. So the doctors would ask for something and I'd be like, "What is that?" And this was old school. So we didn't have computer charts or anything. And they had this giant cabinet that had all the medications. And so I'd look through the list and find the medicine and pull it out and look at it and then go, "Oh, that's what this is." And it would click and I'd be like, "Oh, okay." And there were a lot of health conditions that we just didn't see in the States that the Aboriginals would have.
Oh.
I think it's the largest dialysis center south of the equator is in Alice Springs.
Wow.
Yeah, because there's so many type 2 diabetics that have kidney failure. And so it was almost like baptism by fire. Just figure it out and just keep going and hope that it goes okay. And so that really helped me to learn to roll with it. Just, use the resources you have, try your best, make sure and ask people around you if there's things you're struggling with. So that really, really helped in learning how to navigate challenging situations, but also just raising kids, I feel like does that to you. You learn how to adapt quickly when you have more than a couple kids, you don't really have a choice.
Right. That's a great positive way to think about those challenging years of having several little children, right?
Yeah.
Some people are so afraid to have kids, and yet I love hearing that it helped you learn how to be adaptable. And
yeah, I mean, my mom would talk about that all the time. She had 8 kids in 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And so she said, you just learn to make, go with your priority. Is the screaming child the priority, or is it the kid that's about to touch something hot? It's the kid that's about to touch something hot. The screaming kid's going to survive.
Right.
So,
right. And then those same kids grew up to be right there at your side and surrounding you when you needed them.
Oh,
I
man,
love that.
I'm so lucky with my siblings.
You have a great family. You have really fun siblings too.
Maybe it was all the music that she made us play.
It could be. It could be.
I don't know.
Your mom was fun. How do you manage the grief involving your mom? Because she's been gone now for 3 years, 3.5 years.
Yeah, she died January of 2022.
Wow. Yeah. So just 3 years.
Yeah. It's almost just a little over 3 years now. I miss her terribly, but there are things that, like my dad, he transcribed one of her journals for us. That was when she was in the throes of raising little kids. And that has been incredibly insightful to me. And the other thing he did is he compiled all of the talks and lessons she gave in church for us.
Wow.
So I feel like I have this database that I can access in moments. And that has helped some.
Yes.
So I do that, but I do miss her terribly. She was such a wealth of wisdom and just experience, and always had the right things to say. And I don't know, I try to embody who she was and say, okay, what is the right choice to make in this situation? What would my mom do?
Right.
What would she say to do?
Right.
Would she say, Fee, come on?
She so genuine and so fun.
Yeah.
Well, how have you changed as a person because of this experience with Micah?
Oh, it's changed me so much. I don't know if I can put that into words. So I tried to go back working in the pediatric ER just a couple months after he passed, because I was trying desperately to fill that need of being a caregiver, because that was my identity for so long. So ER was something I knew. I felt like, I can jump back into this and do it, not anticipating that there would be moments that would bring the grief back in such a way that it would almost disable me and stop me from being able to care properly for the patients. But one thing I discovered while working in the pediatric emergency department was that I truly have a soft spot for medically complex children and children that are trying to overcome odds that are not in their favor. And I see those kids as just true angels. There is nothing more pure than those sweet souls. And there was one point where my manager pulled me aside and said, "Are you doing okay?" Because I had 3 very medically complex kids in my 3 of my 4 rooms had very medically complex kids. And I said, "I am loving this.
Oh,
I can be here for these families. I know what to say to them. I know how to connect them with resources because I've had to do it." And so I ultimately left the ER because it just got to be too much. It got to be too much physically and emotionally to be in those high stress situations. Right. So I ended up telling my old main home health nurse, who I love dearly, I can't handle this anymore and I'm going to leave the ER. And she said, "Well, if you want to come and work for the home health agency, I can find you the perfect family." I said, I don't know. Just let me have some time. And in the fall, she contacted me and said, "I have a family for you." And they had these two incredibly cute little boys that have severe epilepsy. And so it's right in my wheelhouse. It's what I know and love. And they're the most precious, darling children. And they very sadly moved out of Washington State. But I have a new little girl that I take care of that is just darling and wonderful. So I feel like I can give that service now. Like, I know I've been in these parents' shoes.
Right.
So I know how to help them to advocate for their child. And I know what equipment there is and what services are available to help their lives be just better and their child to do better. And it's really, really rewarding.
Oh, that is amazing. And you can do this without being triggered so much with the grief.
Yeah, there are still moments, but they're far and few between because we're not in those health crises most of the time. There have been a few times where there are health crises at work, and I feel like I'm able to help the parents navigate those better without having those triggering grief responses.
Wow. That's marvelous. Those families are really fortunate to have you, because not only do you have the training, but you have that empathy that comes from, like you said, having walked in those shoes before. What a perfect combination. I love that. Well, Annalee, it's been such a pleasure. I love catching up with you, hearing more about your experience with Micah. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. And before we finish, I always end with the question, what do you think it means to grieve well?
Grieving well isn't necessarily forgetting the past and forgetting the things you've been through. Grieving well is learning how to embody that and to bring it into the present and to better yourself, to better address the needs of those around you through what you have learned and what you have developed into. Because grief allows you to develop a relationship with the Lord that would not have existed without it. It helps you to become a strong and stalwart person that can stand up and help those around you. And I really, really firmly believe that that is the purpose of this, is to help us to learn to love. And I'm so excited that I get to do that now.
Thank you so much, Annalee. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. It's great to chat with you.
Yeah. All right.